Do you know that feeling? You scroll through social media or watch a political talk show and it seems like the tone is getting harsher, the positions more uncompromising. It feels as if the fronts are completely hardened and real conversation is almost impossible. Exactly this feeling is our starting point today. So let's dive right in. It is often the same topics that trigger strong emotions: migration, integration, Islam. But why is that? Why do these debates seem trapped in a constant cycle of escalation? To understand this, we will look at the analyses of the historian Klaus J. Bade. His work helps us recognize the deeper patterns behind all the noise. This is the core idea that guides us today. Violence does not suddenly appear out of nowhere. It has a history, and that history is often written with words. When certain groups are repeatedly portrayed as a problem in public debates, this creates the ground for something far worse. So let's begin with part 1. When words become weapons. This is about the fundamental power of language to shape our perception and ultimately influence reality. A quote from legal scholar Matthias Rogue captures this perfectly. Violent acts do not happen in a vacuum. They need a certain climate, a breeding ground in which they can grow. And this climate is often created by what he calls intellectual arsonists, people who create an atmosphere with their words in which hatred and violence suddenly become thinkable, and for some even legitimate. The logic behind this process is subtle but clear. It often begins with a group not being directly attacked but constantly portrayed as the source of problems. Over time, this creates a climate of exclusion. For extremists who are already willing to use violence, this becomes almost an invitation. Public debates appear to confirm their worldview and provide ideological justification for their actions. They start to believe they are acting in the name of a silent majority. This leads us to part 2. The mechanics of exclusion. How is such a hostile climate created on a social psychological level? At its core, it always involves constructing a division between us and them. The key concept here is negative integration. The idea is simple: a strong sense of community can grow from positive foundations, shared values, goals, culture. But it can also grow in a negative way. Instead of defining who we are, people define who they are not. The us becomes stronger by devaluing the others and portraying them as a threat. A shared enemy is often an easier, and sometimes stronger, bond than a complex set of shared values. This dynamic often turns public debates into proxy battles for completely different fears. When heated arguments about criticism of Islam occur, they are often less about theology and more about vague fears of losing identity in a globalized world. The accusation of failed integration can become a convenient way to distract from political mistakes. And the term over-foreignization is often simply a code for anxiety about rapid social change that many people find overwhelming. The debate on the surface is rarely the real debate underneath. This brings us to the third point: the historical development of the issue. The conflicts we see today have a long prehistory. It is also a story of political avoidance when it comes to immigration in Germany. The timeline shows a clear pattern. In 1973, the recruitment stop was meant to end immigration. Instead, it produced the opposite effect. Because returning became uncertain, many workers brought their families to Germany. Guest workers became immigrants. During the 1980s, the government under Chancellor Kohl largely refused to acknowledge this new reality. Bade describes this as a demonstrative refusal to recognize reality. The conflict even led the Federal Commissioner for Foreigners, Cornelia Funk, to resign in protest in 1991. It took until 2006, more than 30 years later, for the realization to be openly acknowledged at the highest political level. A statement by former German President Horst Kohler marked a turning point. It was an official recognition that politics had ignored reality for decades. Instead of shaping immigration policy, leaders avoided planning and simply hoped the issue would resolve itself. This leads to the fourth and final point: why these patterns repeat themselves. It is about the typical dynamics of escalation and the often hypocritical way crises are later interpreted. The crises we see today rarely appear suddenly. They develop because long-known problems are ignored. Instead of addressing them politically, responsibility is pushed downward, to municipalities, schools, and local communities. And when tensions finally explode, the surprise suddenly seems enormous. At that point we often hear the phrase, "No one could have known." But history shows something different. Bade's analysis demonstrates that for decades there were scientific warnings and well-grounded studies. Yet politically they were dismissed as exaggerated or alarmist. When the predictions later came true, they were described as coincidences instead of the result of predictable developments. A quote from Wolfgang Schäuble, one of Germany's most experienced politicians, illustrates this dilemma. On the one hand, it is understandable to want to focus on the future. But on the other hand, this attitude can prevent an honest reflection on past mistakes. And without such reflection, societies risk repeating the same mistakes again and again. So the key question for all of us is this: how can we break this cycle of denial, escalation, and later surprise? This is not about assigning blame but about developing a clearer understanding of how these debates work. We can start with 3 simple but powerful steps. First, pay attention to language. Ask whether a discussion is about a real issue, or whether people themselves are being framed as the problem. Second, demand responsibility. Do not accept the excuse that no one could have known when warnings existed for years. Third, always analyze the broader context. Escalations almost never happen suddenly. They are usually the result of long and often ignored developments. And with that, I want to leave you with one final question. If violence begins with words, then the most important question is not only what we do about violent actions, but which words we must pay attention to today so they do not become the justification for actions tomorrow. Today we discussed a work by Klaus J. Bade, 2013. Do you have questions or topic suggestions? Feel free to write to youtube@empowermigra.com. EmpowerMIgra, understanding begins with listening.